Clerk, will you please, woo. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Bajent,
Here.
Clegg,
Woo.
she is present. I think
Here, sorry about that.
that's okay. Halliburton,
Here.
Sanchez, Thompson,
Here.
Woodings,
Here.
Sanchez,
Here.
all present.
Thank you. First up, we have our work session items is the water renewal utility plan. I see Steve, you're wearing a suit and a coat and a tie. Welcome.
I mean, if I have it, I might as well wear it, right? It's been a while.
Can somebody, is it Matt or whoever's in is it super loud to you guys? Could we adjust the volume in the room just a bit? Whoever's out there. They'll hear me. Okay, great. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, Madam Mayor, thank you very much. Council members, thanks for the time this afternoon. Let me share my screen. Let's see if I can figure this out. There we go. Go to first slide. There we go. So again, thank you for the time. I really appreciate it. And in many ways, this is a restart to a process that we started back in March, but then COVID-19 had other plans. So what we're going to cover today is somewhat similar to what we covered in March. There'll be some kind of reminder slides from what we covered in March, but then we're going to cover some information on how we plan to engage the council in the process, given the challenges of COVID-19. We had this really nice process laid out over 6 months, but we had to scrap that. So working with Councilmember Bajent, who's our council sponsor on this work, and thank you to him for several phone calls that were really helpful to us in trying to figure out how best to present the information to you. We've come up with a revised plan that we'll share with you today that we'll be getting through it over the next couple of months. So today we'll cover the water renewal history briefly, talk about the current state of the utility. We'll get into the utility plan process at a very high level, talking about some of the utility drivers and how they're evolving. Then we'll look at the planning process itself, and then next steps with council. So again, thank you for the time. So starting back, if we go back a ways, providing a historical perspective, the river was not always in the shape that it is in today. In fact, in the 40s and 50s, it was in pretty bad shape. We had a lot of pollution. It was kind of the burial ground for a lot of trash. You can see the pictures here, old car bodies. And the river itself, the quality of the river was bad. We had raw sewage being put into the river. We had industries up and down the river. We had cholera outbreaks. And so back in the 40s and 50s, the river was in pretty bad shape. And in many ways, I think it was the first time, at least that I can think of, where Boise kind of rose up and said, we can do better. And in this case, it was the state of the river. And you've seen this slide before, and it's one of my favorites because it really is kind of the birth of water renewal services as we know it today. And that's a letter from the League of Women Voters urging Boiseans to vote yes on a bond election in November of 1947 to build what we now know today as the Lander Street Water Renewal Facility. And so to me, this is a good framing of our origins started with the citizens saying that we want something better. There was no federal mandate at the time, but it was just, and specifically the League of Women Voters saying we can do better. And so out of that came the Lander Street facility. And throughout our recent years, that the generations before us have taken steps to address various water quality issues, or they've taken innovative approaches to different problems. And I think that's part of the legacy of water renewal services. So thinking about Lander Street being constructed back in 1949, that's 23 years before the Clean Water Act. So there was no federal mandate. It was Boise saying we can do better, and we built the Lander Street facility. We built the West Boise facility, which is the quote unquote newer of the two facilities back in '76. And primarily that facility was built off of grant money from the federal government that was associated with the Clean Water Act. 1994, we purchased a 20-mile south farm. We're one of only a handful of cities that own their own farm and apply their biosolids for local crop production. Back in '94, nobody had done that before. Again, innovation in the Water Renewal Fund. You can see the Dixie Drain Facility constructed in 2016. So we have a history of the generations before us taking action and either pursuing innovation or doing things well ahead of the need arising. And I think of that as a vision that folks had back then for where we could go into the future. And the result of that is we've made significant progress on the Boise River. What we knew it to be back in the 40s and 50s is very different from what it is today. It's a pretty amazing urban river. And for all of us who have probably taken time to float it, there's times where you're going through downtown and you would never know it. And these are just two articles, the Wall Street Journal and the Statesman, that were articles that were talking about how the river really has changed and turned around. To the point where I think the river has become, in my opinion, one of the most, if not our most treasured piece of green infrastructure. And this is a beautiful picture of the river running right through our downtown core. And Water Renewal Services, we feel pretty strongly that we're one of the key pieces of that success. And moving forward, we're going to continue to build upon that legacy. And part of the utility plan moving forward is thinking about how do we enhance the river, but then how do we go beyond? One of the things that we've heard very clearly from our citizen engagement over the past 4 years is that the river is hallowed ground, and that the citizens expect more from us, the group of men and women who form Water Renewal Services. And we're going to share that with you over the next couple of months, kind of what they told us. But just know that we heard very clearly from our community that they expect more from Water Renewal Services. So Water Renewal Services specifically, when I took over as director, it's hard to believe it's been 3.5 years that I've been serving as director. One of the first initiatives that we undertook was to rename Water Renewal Services. Before, it was known as the Sewer Fund or the Wastewater Fund. It wasn't really capturing really what we were bringing to the table. I felt pretty strongly that we could reframe it to better describe the services. Words are important. And these words that you see on the screen are important to us. They better describe the services that we're providing to the citizens. We renew things. There's not a whole lot of waste at these facilities. We give new life to used water. And so the wording and that change was important to use the proper terminology, we felt. And now moving forward, we want to take that even the next step further. And how does it start to become even more actionable? Certainly we are renewing products, but there's more we can do in the future. And I think the name change was one thing, but now what are the actions that take place when we think about climate change? We think about potentially recycling water, for example. So today, kind of if I were reflecting on it, I have we here because I think we, being the community, certainly me as the director, I inherited a well-run utility. We have competitive rates. There's a lot of innovation if you walk around our facilities that may not be readily available to your average citizen, but if you come on the site and get a tour, you'll see that. We have very sound utility financials, and I'm somewhat biased, but I think we have outstanding staff. And so we inherited a well-run utility. And when I think about today and where we are, it's set us up now for us to be able to set the next 20 years, the next several decades of what can come, because we have a very sound foundation to start from. And so here's some stats of just who we are today. So we treat about 30 million gallons of used water per day. We have over 200 staff that are just part of the water renewal utility alone. We perform about 730,000 water quality lab analyses. That $50 million per year operating budget is important, in part because that sets a context for what we're going to be presenting to you in the future. So if I take the $50 million a year that we spend on operating and I run that for the next 20 years, if we made no other changes to the system, we'd be spending about $1 billion on just operations, right? We haven't necessarily talked about the utility in those kind of, in that context before, the billion word or hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think that's important. It provides context to some of the solutions that we're going to be recommending to you in the future that do have a significant price tag. That's not lost on me. I know that's something we have to be very careful about, but it is not out of the realm of what we currently do today, which if we just did consistently what we did today for the next 20 years, we'd be spending $1 billion just on operating. And then in the middle there, you see the approximate 100% service uptime. And that's something that we take great pride in. And I say approximately because we do have, periodically, we'll have a home that has a backup for example, and we may need to ask them, hey, let's not use the shower for today or tomorrow, but we'll get it fixed. But generally speaking, those are very rare occurrences. And it's not as if we've ever had like the southeast part of town or West Boise or the North End, hey, you can't take a shower or use the bathroom for the next 3 days or for the next 7 hours. Because our folks are very focused on maintaining that uptime. And so we typically don't ever ask folks not to use our system, only in the case of where it might be a onesie twosie backup within a home. So that's something that we're very proud of. And when we move into the future and we start thinking about replacement of aging assets, you'll see as we go through the next couple of months, one of our biggest cost items is to start replacing aging assets. And that's related back up to making sure that we can maintain that approximate 100% service uptime. But we know going into the future that things are changing. And I think one of the things that jumped out to us as we did the last 3 years of community engagement was that our citizens are expecting more from us. They expect us to take on things like climate change and think about how the utility can help address, say, drought conditions. We heard very clearly from them that environmental protection beyond the minimums is of interest and that they're willing to pay a little bit more additional if we can show the value of that additional investment. I mentioned the aging infrastructure. For better or worse, I'm the director where a lot of the infrastructure is starting to age out, with the Lander Street facility being the great example. It was built in '49, so it's 70 years old, and it has been a great facility, but it has run its course, and we need to be replacing it over the next 20 years. Certainly, we've had growth in the past, and we continue to have growth in the future, and we've got to figure out how to add capacity in a smart way that might support other outcomes that we want. And then affordability hasn't necessarily been an issue for us in the past, and I say that with some caution. I'm not suggesting that our services are free. I know it costs people, and certainly for folks on a fixed income, it's not insignificant. But I think when I look forward and thinking about the percent of our utility bills for certain income brackets, it's starting to become a higher percentage that we think needs to get addressed. And so we're going to be talking to you about affordability and talking about maybe innovative ways of funding projects in the future where we can have an eye towards affordability to make sure that we can make it as cost effective as possible. And so if I were to think about the utility plan and what we're trying to frame for you all, it's really trying to think about how do we integrate today's needs with an eye towards what's coming in the future. So near-term needs, we want to continue on our proven capabilities. We know how to meet regulatory requirements. That's like our 101. We know how to do that. We know how to replace aging assets. We're in the middle of a lot of that right now. And we know how to address capacity issues to meet growth demands. But then how do we do that with an eye towards the future, this longer term vision? And we've heard very clearly, as I mentioned, from the community, they expect things from us. One of the things that they've been very clear about is they expect us to consider recycled water as an asset for our community. They expect us to enhance the health and uses of the Boise River, and maybe beyond just the minimum regulatory requirements. They expect us to address things like climate change and balance affordability. And so when I think about our plan, what we tried to do was integrate our near-term needs. So for example, we know we're gonna have to bring on new capacity, new treatment capacity as we grow. But we wanna do that in a way that allows us to leverage potentially the ability to recycle water. So maybe I'm stealing my own thunder a little bit, but maybe in the future, when we bring on new capacity, it'll be in a way that it's only new capacity that can be used that promotes recycled water, instead of just adding capacity at existing facilities where we couldn't recycle it, it would just go in the river. So that's where we're trying to make sure that we're balancing the near-term needs with that longer-term vision and trying to integrate the two. And so our plan, we feel pretty strongly that it's a plan for our community that was built by our community. When we first went out to the community for feedback, we didn't go to them with a solution or even 2 or 3 solutions. We went to them and said, we can do a lot of stuff with this water, for example. We could do everything from drinking it, which would be direct potable reuse, where we basically take the water to treat the water to a drinking water level. Or we can just continue what we do today. and help us understand where you are on that continuum. And then as we started getting more feedback on that kind of question, then we had focus groups, and then we had the advisory group, and they all were telling us and giving us feedback, helping direct us to these portfolios that we're going to share with you in the coming months. It wasn't us that came up with the portfolios. It was from the community. We just tried to frame the technical questions around them. We evaluated a lot of our system using baseline data. So we reset the as-is condition to make sure we knew inside and out the current status of our system, so that when we were planning for the future, we had a strong foundation based on data. We were very, very cognizant of managing long-term risk costs. And so we're only one of a handful of utilities that's trying to quantify risk costs. And we'll show you how we did that in the future memos and presentations. But we wanted to be proactive about that so that we could demonstrate to the community that we're not waiting around for something to happen to us. We're trying to manage it so we can be proactive in developing solutions. The triple bottom line was a big part of our analysis. So we looked at obviously the financial implications of decisions. We considered the environmental outcomes, but we also looked at things like the community cost of carbon. So that if a solution had a higher energy need, we wanted to make sure we captured that risk cost associated with basically the discharge of pollutants from production of electricity. So we wanted to capture that triple bottom line. And as I mentioned before, we hadn't necessarily been as deliberate about affordability, but we know that's becoming a bigger issue. So we're being deliberate about that now. And if we've done this right, and you all will be the judge of that, frankly, if we've done this right, we'll have this recommended approach that will fit inside these boundary conditions of financial capacity, asset conditions, system demands, and stakeholder interests. And I guess if I can be even more frank, if I've done my job right, we'll have delivered the least total cost of ownership while meeting Boise's expectations. It's not the least cost, period. It's the least cost of ownership while making sure that we understood we're meeting the higher expectations that Boiseans are asking us to meet. And so again, we'll frame all this over the next couple of months, but I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on the approach and what made it unique. And so going back to our public engagement piece, this was kind of the foundation from which we moved forward. And you can see on the left, there are pictures of the advisory group. We've got some social media that we're asking folks to take the surveys. And all told, we were able to get out to about 2,700 plus citizens who had some type of involvement in our engagement efforts. And Colin Hickman, who's our community engagement lead for Public Works, is going to get into the details of that through the memo. And then if you have questions, we can certainly get those addressed as we go through the next couple of months, describing the process to you. So let's talk about the next couple of months. What are the next steps? And so this is a fairly detailed table, but I just want to walk through this with you. And this is kind of our adjustment to addressing the process given the challenges of COVID. So this is the introduction happening today on the 28th. On the 4th and the 11th, you're going to get two memorandums, one on the 4th, describing our approach to infrastructure condition and capacity. And then the next memo on the 11th, they'll talk about climate change and regulatory requirements and how we address that in the plan. You'll note there's no council meetings on those, so you'll just be getting memos on those particular issues. On the 18th, we're going to have a presentation on the state of recycled water. So if you recall, about over a year ago, we had some citizens that expressed concern about recycled water. And so we hired a global consultant, Corolla Engineers, who's doing work around the world and know the state of the art on recycled water and concerns over emerging constituents. We're going to give you that presentation because moving forward, we are going to propose recycled water as part of our utility. And we want to make sure that you all understand and have the most recent information on the state of recycled water. And we'll have that expert available on the Zoom call. On the 18th and the 25th, you'll get two more memos, one on community engagement and expectations. And on the 25th, the financial capacity and affordability memo. And then we'll have the recommended approach presentation on September 1st. And then the public hearing, I think let me move the box here. Yeah, September 15th, the public hearing. And that's all leading to a month later, we'll have the council utility plan decision. And our hope is that you'll be supportive of the recommended approach. So let me stop there. I have a couple more slides, but before I move on to those, just any questions on the updated approach with council?
Madam Mayor. I'm going to assume that's a go.
I'm sorry,
my-
I didn't have my mic on. I didn't know it.
That's okay. To my colleagues, one of the things that Steve and I talked about was how to deliver a huge amount of information to us in a pandemic world instead of a pre-pandemic world. Renovating Lander Street is huge. The amount of money we're talking about is huge, right? Our most contentious budget items in the last series of meetings we had are like rounding errors for the amount of time and energy that we're going to be putting into this. And in an ordinary world, we would get a lot of meetings and a lot of opportunity to ask Steve all the questions that we have and to really work through this in the ordinary workflow. Along with the council president and with her permission, what I told Steve was give us homework and we will do it. So that's why you see memos during our break. You see various portions of this are memo only. That memo is in lieu of the presentation that we'd have. And so if you get frustrated with the volume of paperwork that's going to be coming your way on this, it's my fault and you should yell at me and definitely not Steve.
Thanks, Councilman. Appreciate that.
Hear her. Hi,
Thanks.
Council President, did you ask to?
Yes, yes, please. Thank you. So I appreciate Councilmember Bajan talking about the homework, and we did talk about that. In a leadership meeting, we also talked about the fact that sometimes people have questions about their homework, and in some cases, it's a while until we have another presentation, and that presentation will be focused on something else. So we ask the staff to figure out some opportunity for those of you who do have homework questions to be able to ask those and get those answered. I don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, Steve, I guess, but just know that you will be expected to read it, but after you read it, whatever doesn't make sense is free game for making Steve scratch his head and answer us.
Yep. And Madam Mayor, Council President, thank you for that. And yeah, we're working on figuring out how best to do that. And so we'll be coming back to council leadership with a kind of recommended approach on how best to do that. Thank you. Okay, couple more slides and then we'll wrap it up and open it up to questions. So as we're going through that process with council, we do have a very intentional process with the public. And so we'll have a concurrent process, as you saw those dates laid out, a concurrent process with the public. Social media, there'll be online stories, we'll be requesting feedback. We're going to post all of these memos to the city website. We have a water renewal utility plan website that's should go live. If it's not already, it should be live in the next probably 5 to 10 minutes. So we'll have those memos posted for access to anyone who wants to see those. And then once we get all of our public feedback, all the feedback from the past 3 years, but also the feedback that we'll get in the coming couple of months, that will all be compiled and submitted with the packet that goes to council with the recommended approach. So you'll see all that, and we'll be highlighting if we're hearing, a fair amount of feedback that's suggesting something different or in support of, we'll be sharing that with you in the packet related to the plan. And then this was a really helpful piece from Councilmember Bajan. We were struggling with how to, like, if we were to try to summarize this down into like 3 or 4 key policy questions that we wanted you to be thinking about as you're reading through the memos, as we're presenting information to you, what would those be? And so these are the 3 policy questions we want you to be thinking about as you're reviewing your homework and as we're giving presentations. And I'll read these to you because I think they're important and they help frame the policy moving forward that will then address the projects we come back to you with in the coming years. And so the first policy question: should the city continue to proactively and prudently invest in our infrastructure to address capacity needs, system degradation, and growing regulatory requirements to prevent system failures? Second question: should Boise optimize the management of resources to include recycled water? And then the third question, should the utility continue exploring alternative methods of financing projects and consider changes to our business model and cost structure? And then the real kind of rub question, I think, is we would like council to confirm that the utility plan effectively addresses the policy questions, assuming that there aren't any other policy questions that come up between now and the next couple of months. And so in summary, what we're asking for, to be very clear, what we're asking from council is affirmation on the 3 key policy questions: investment in existing infrastructure, pursuit of recycled water, and continue to investigate funding alternatives. And then we are asking for approval of the water renewal utility plan in a couple of months. And the approval implies that the plan supports the policy direction. I think just as important is to frame what we're not asking you yet. We're not asking you to approve a specific project yet. And we're not asking you to approve a specific funding strategy yet. As we started thinking about how do we start to implement the plan, it became very apparent we have to make sure we're all on the same policy, have the same policy ideas moving forward before we can start recommending projects to you all. So we're not going to come to you in 2 months from now and say we want to build this facility in this location and it will do X. That's in the coming years. Similarly, we're not going to say we want to take on this amount of debt and it'll result in this impact on rates. That's coming in the next 6 to 12 months. But we do want approval or affirmation rather of the 3 key policy questions, and then approval of the plan, i.e. the plan supports the policy questions. And with that, I will stand for questions.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Hi, Steve. It's so good to see you. Thank you for the presentation. So in the community input that you've received so far, has there been an area of concern that has risen to the top?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Sanchez, probably the one that has risen to the top is affordability, to the extent that folks are asking us to do more, but they want us to balance that with affordability. And so another way I interpret that is they don't necessarily want the quote unquote cheapest option, lowest cost option, but they want value. So they want us to optimize the projects, the proposed projects in the future, balancing that with cost. And then we kind of took that a step further and thought, okay, well, what are the other tools in our toolbox that can help us address affordability? And that's where we'll be talking to you all about bond financing and maybe taking on debt to fund some of these projects. But I think that was probably the one issue that was, we want you to do these things, but we also need you to be balancing affordability with those extra items that we're asking you to take on.
Thank you, Steve. One follow-up question, Madam Mayor. I think for folks who actually pay attention to these issues, the one that I've heard about is people having concerns about recycling water. Did you hear anything like that in those community conversations?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Sanchez, within most of the outreach we did, whether it was the surveys or whether it was the advisory group, that was not a major issue. It did come up, though, within the context of folks in the Northwest who were concerned about the quality of recycled water. And so that was where we had that response of we halted any further discussion of recycled water. We brought in the global expert to make sure we understood the state of recycled water, and we'll share that information with you. So it didn't come up broadly with the discussion with the advisory group or focus groups or the surveys. It did come up with the number of citizens in the Northwest specifically.
And what is their concern?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Sanchez, their concern is that there might be emerging constituents in the water, even if it's treated at the water renewal facility, that might still be in the water and impact, say, for example, a canal, an irrigation canal. And so, absolutely legitimate concern. We want to make sure we're eyes wide open on that. And one thing I think in public works that we're very proud of is we rely on data, we rely on science, and that's why we went out and tried to find the experts to help us navigate that.
Great, thank you, Steve.
Okay. Madam Mayor. Thank you. On the 3 policy questions, Steve, what you're seeking affirmation of investment in existing infrastructure and in particular capacity, pursuit of recycled water, and investigating alternatives. I think those are the right 3 things, but I've been talking with you about them. And so for my colleagues, I think the recycled water is a pretty easy one to say, yes, we want to keep this at least on the priority list until we see a reason not to. I think investigating funding alternatives is also a pretty easy one because you want to at least look at it until you come up with a compelling reason to say yes or no. But can you help my colleagues and the public understand what the alternatives to investing in capacity and infrastructure might be? In other words, that one made the list. Some other things didn't make the list. What is the cooking that went into all of that?
Sure, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Bajent, good question. When we start thinking about capacity and replacement of aging infrastructure, in many ways, that's like the meat and potatoes of what we do. We manage the system so that we can accommodate new connections, whether they be economic development. A new company wants to come to Boise. It's not a good day for the director to tell the mayor, sorry, we can't have that company here because we don't have the capacity at the water renewal facility. So managing capacity and being smart about where we put that is one of the things that that's meat and potatoes. Same thing on the aging infrastructure. If we don't address, so for example, the Lander Street facility, we've had condition assessments done of the headworks and of some of the aeration basins. We have concrete spalling in some of those basins, and that's starting to expose some of the rebar. That's starting to become a safety issue. That got my hackles up when I've seen some videos, and I'm concerned about the safety for staff. But beyond just safety, which is priority number 1 for us, if we have a catastrophic failure at the headworks, remember I talked about the 100%. We try to provide 100% uptime. We won't be able to use Lander Street. That's the first process in the treatment process, the headworks. If that collapses, the inlet, the wet well in the headworks, we're hard down. So those 2 are fundamental to what we do as a utility. And so you'll see when we share the costs of those are the 2 largest funding categories. And I'll say that on capacity in particular, in Idaho, growth has to pay for growth. And that's been something that's been a foundational piece for our system for years. So when I say that, I mean, the current ratepayers can't pay for the addition of the capacity. That's going to come through connection fees. So we have 2 ways that we fund things. One is through rates. We use that for our operations. And then connection fees. So if I'm a new house or I'm a new business, when I come to town, I need to buy my portion of the water renewal facility. And so that capacity question is one that is very important that we plan for, but we have to do it in a way that growth pays for growth. And we'll describe that to you, how we do that in the memos and in the recommended approach. Is that answering your question?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, it's challenging for me because these are all so obviously the right things to be doing in my mind. But I guess tell me if you think I'm wrong, right? Investment in existing capacity and infrastructure as a primary objective for what we're going to be going through in the next 6 months to a year, in my mind, absolutely should be the first policy goal on the list because it is what a public works department does. The alternative is business wants to come to Boise and it can't come here. The alternative is large swaths of our city on the bench or elsewhere where a bunch of infrastructure went in at the same time suddenly experience catastrophic failures that we have to pay real money immediately to fix. The alternative is not having a functioning water system. And so in my mind, this policy objective is correct, but there are alternatives. We can certainly not do it. And the reason it's on here is because you think, and I think this is the best thing for your team to be doing.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Council Member, yes, absolutely. I mean, if we start to see failures happening in the system, one, not only does it create a reactive environment where we're just scrambling and going from fire to fire or crisis to crisis, but then you start having the regulatory agencies get involved with consent orders and consent decrees, which are never pleasant. And typically that then leads to lawsuits. So we're trying to be as proactive as possible and prudent on the reinvestment in infrastructure, and also having that capacity to be able to meet needs going forward. And a lot of those could be economic development needs. We want to be able to say yes. So yeah, the outcomes of not investing can be catastrophic for communities. And we've seen that in other cities across the US. And if it would help, we can provide examples of cities that are in the middle of consent orders and consent decrees because they've had failing systems, and that's not a pleasant situation.
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
Thank you. So Steve, I guess both those questions kind of set up the thing that I've been thinking about, and absolutely agree that investing in our existing infrastructure, replacing our aging infrastructure, and making sure that we keep up with growth is enormously important policy to, not decision, it's certainly what we've been doing, but policy direction that we should affirm. What I see missing from this list, and it's captured a little bit in water renewal, is our continued commitment to innovation and excellence. And I think you get at it in a lot of what you're talking about in terms of balancing affordability with the needs and wants of the community. But I guess I would prefer to be a little more explicit about it. And perhaps number two could be adjusted somewhat to talk about innovation and risk-taking with a, for instance, about water renewal, recycled water. And affirming recycled water because it's the one we know about right now. But until we knew about it, we didn't know about phosphorus. And until we knew about that, we couldn't have conceived of Dixie Drain. But if we hadn't had a culture that pointed toward the innovation, we wouldn't have done that. So I want to make sure we don't lose that, because I think it's been such an important part of the culture of this particular utility.
Madam Mayor, Council President, we'll tweak number two. That's really good feedback. That's fair feedback, and I think you're right. Innovation has been so foundational to the utility. We'll think about how to reword two to better capture the emphasis on innovation and excellence that has driven so many of the previous decisions. So we'll take that one on for action.
Thank you.
Yes, Councilmember.
Steve and Councilmember Bainjit, thanks for your work that went into this. It's obvious that you've put a lot of time and thought, and I think it's tremendously exciting. And also, like Councilmember Bainjit said, some of these things seem like real no-brainers. Like, yes, these are absolutely things that we would want to invest in. I guess one thing that would be helpful for me, Steve, and I don't need you to do this right now, would be to help me and other council members with the policy things that we could provide that would be helpful as far as addressing behavioral issues for our citizens, and how we as citizens can assist in the work that you're doing here. And I think back about for a while during the beginning of this pandemic, when we were flushing everything that we could think of down the toilet and the cost that ends up having on your facilities. And if there aren't more things like that, whether it's the products that we use, the products that we sell at our businesses, a variety of different areas, if there's things that we can address at a policy level that help things like recycling water, that reduce the amount of effluents that might be going into some of the canals in Northwest Boise, those types of things, that you please let me know how I and other council members can be supportive in policy areas that assist you with these three things.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton, we will do that. That's a good question. We'll think about it. I'll talk with Colin and the team, and we'll think about areas where, whether it's behavioral change, like something that comes to mind right off the bat is just water efficiency, right? If we're using less water, then we have less water that we need to treat. So we're pretty good about that in Boise, but maybe we can do better. But I'll think about that. That's I appreciate that perspective. Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Go ahead.
Steve, I just wanted to thank you and your team. I know that this is a tremendous amount of work, and it's not always the sexiest and most exciting work that we do at the city, is how we carry water away from our homes and treat it to the right level to put back into our river, and all of the many mitigation strategies that your team does to ensure the health of our river, which I think is so important. So thank you so much for doing all this work. This is going to be a huge investment. I think, you know, at first blush, I agree with all of these policy feedback questions. But I also recognize that it's going to be a years-long process. It's going to cost a lot of money. I think when everyone sees the price tag, it's going to be, you know, something to behold. And I just want you to know that you have my support, at least, in continuing this work. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Council Pro Tem, I really appreciate that. The support from council has been great today. We really appreciate it. And we are going to come with some big numbers, and we don't take that lightly. So we appreciate the support, and we'll do our best to try to explain where everything's coming from and why it's happening.
All right, there's a moment, just a lull. So I think, Steve, if you've gotten what you think you need for next steps, you've got this. Are you exiting out or moving on? Okay, great. Yeah, if you think that you've got what you need right now to advance, then move on to the next thing. I really appreciate the work and planning that's gone into presenting this to council, because it is indeed a multi-year effort that we're going to have to undertake. And it's and Councilman Bajent, thanks for working with Steve on this, because it will have like long-term impacts and benefits, really like good impacts for our residents if we start planning now.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. It was great to see you.
Yeah, good seeing you too.
All right, next up, we've we've got an executive session.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, I move we go into executive session to discuss personal land acquisitions and pending likely litigation under Idaho Code 74206, 1B, and F.
Second.
We have a motion, a second. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Thompson,
Yes.
Woodings,
Yes.
Bajent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
We'll be back on Teams in a second.
Thank you.